PressFix is a production of EurekaJohn, where we explore the intersections of decentralization, media, and independent journalism. Can decentralization save local media and rebuild connection at the community level? Join us and find out.
Hello and welcome to PressFix Podcast, the official podcast of EurekaJohn. My name is EurekaJohn, and I'm your host for today. Being a DAO, we may or may not have different hosts on different days, but we do pride ourselves in being a flattened organization, a decentralized autonomous organization. So yes, today we have everybody with us. We have Crystal Street, Clinamenic, Keith Axline, and Eric Mack. I guess we can start with some introductions and just kind of let people know who we are, what we're about, why we decided we wanted to do a podcast. So yeah, who wants to go first?
Hi, I'm Crystal. I am a founding member here at EurekaJohn and as a former photojournalist for several decades. And I've been in the crypto space since 2017 and also an academic. I study yoga and Buddhism.
I'm Spencer. I'm a founding member of EurekaJohn. No experience in journalism prior to this, but around a year's worth of experience in the DAO space and core a couple other DAOs. And I had the pleasure of getting acquainted with Eric through this DAO space and got more and more involved in EurekaJohn. And it's been a pleasure to watch the vision evolve.
Yeah, I'm Eric, also a co-founder, and have been a journalist for over 20 years. And part of that is following blockchain since shortly after its inception and kind of waiting for some more practical uses to arrive. And then finally, about a year and a half ago, deciding maybe it was time to try to find some folks to team up with to do that ourselves. So yeah, with the whole goal here is to figure out how to merge traditional journalism and Web3, all for the benefit of building back up a more healthy, particularly local journalism ecosystem.
Yeah, I'm Keith Axline. I'm currently a software developer in a few DAOs, but I have previous career in media and journalism at Wired Magazine and Medium, the blogging platform. And during that time, I saw a lot of what was not working with the business model around content and journalism. And so when Eric invited me to EurekaJohn, I was excited to maybe tackle some of these issues head on with fundamentally new tools and concepts that I think were missing while I was in the space.
Okay, and I'm EurekaJohn. I started learning about crypto in 2018 and then went deeper down the rabbit hole and started finding my niche in the Web3 space, learning about decentralized ID, learning about Web3 and journalism. And I met these people here, Eric specifically, where we started talking about decentralized journalism. And there he did a presentation on Web3 and journalism, and it really caught my ear. And I became more interested, and he invited me to EurekaJohn. And here in this community, we've all come here through our own paths and through traditional and non-traditional routes. And I guess the playing field seems like it's kind of level here in this DAO, where journalism is kind of having a reset and having a way to discover tools to bring it out of the ad-driven model and bring it more back to our community. So I guess the term of the day we can start with is, we've been throwing around the term Web3. What does Web3 mean? Who would like to elaborate first on that definition?
To me, it's just the stage of the internet post distributed ledger technology and all the kind of auxiliary technologies associated with that. The kind of meme associated with Web3, which has some truth to it, but perhaps is a bit overused, is that Web 1 was read, Web 2 was write, Web 3 is own. I think we could probably get into the implications of ownership and, should Web3 all just be about ownership? I think there's other interesting implications about community and not just about financializing everything. But it's essentially a way to it does financialize the internet in a lot of respects, but it also allows for verifiably unique ownership of digital assets. It's all operating on like various shared databases. But that's what Web3 means to me. It's just the internet plus distributed ledger technology.
Yeah, I think that's a good definition. Just to elaborate, I'd say that the things that are kind of sticking around, Web3 is an amorphous term that's kind of taken on a life of its own, and like what we would mean like a year ago by Web3 is probably different today. But like currently, I think it's about decentralization. I think services with like a central business, central architecture is probably not going to be Web3. It would at least need an intention to decentralize or plan to decentralize at some point. And also, I think what we can talk about today as far as journalism is decoupling, like where I think we're noticing so many things are paired that probably should not be, like journalism and advertising. And Web3 is kind of a movement to decouple things so that we can, more focus on like what the value proposition as it is, instead of these like sort of legacy path dependencies that we've accumulated over the years that don't actually make much sense and don't really need to be there if we're given a chance to start over. And I think Web3 is kind of a chance to do that, like a blank canvas to get back to first principles, think about how we would build things from the beginning if we know what we know now. And so it actually, has less and less to do with blockchain or crypto in my mind. And it's more like this more pure, like principles driven internet, a publicly owned internet, sort of manifesting the ideals that were initially thrown around like in the mid to late 90s when the internet came to be. So
yeah, along those lines, I see it as removing the gatekeepers, like Keith's alluding to, and introducing alternative economic modalities, like Spencer mentioned. Whereas it's not just monetization for a corporation or some other profit-driven model. It's monetization really through experimenting with different tokenization or access points, and figuring out if we can use those tools to create a public good without government money. So I kind of see that as part of the experimentation aspect, especially for journalism. And as Keith was alluding to also, just returning to like a more humane approach to technology. Like I see that in removing algorithms and the weaponization of information that a lot of centralized platforms have put in place over the last few years, if we can bypass that with this emerging technology, then we can begin to restore a healthy dialogue in our communities through, removing that aspect of polarization that, drove so many corporate models to put the click through above all else. So
one thing, whenever people hear the word Web3 has kind of been a word that we have used to replace the word crypto, because crypto kind of got a bad name from all the shills and scams and the grifters and everything that's out there. And as journalists or people who are wanting to reform journalism in a way, how do you separate Web3 from everything else when you're trying to explain this concept to journalists? And they immediately think, Bored Apes, it's going to drop like everything else. This is all scammy, grifter type of stuff. We just saw what happened with FTX exchange imploding. And yeah, how do you get rid of the chaff?
I mean, I guess it depends how much time you have with the person to explain it, how much they're willing to listen to you talk about it, just because of the bad name that all this has earned from bad actors. But it's, people also paint with too broad of a brush. But I guess I kind of like to put things into a few different buckets in terms of like, what are the areas of intersection for Web3 and journalism. And one actually is, the financial aspect of it, and freelance journalists or small hometown newsrooms being able to have more direct control over their business models and monetization and all that. That's definitely an aspect of it. And the really cool things that we've seen creators in the arts be able to do with monetizing their stuff and without having to go through middlemen via NFTs instead. I think there's no reason that freelancers and other journalists shouldn't be able to do that. So that's kind of one bucket that people are interested in that and should acknowledge. And then there's another bucket that everyone kind of alluded to in their definitions of what Web3 is, and having this distributed ledger technology, but also this kind of more of a community ethos. Exploring that to see how that can change the processes that go into news gathering and publishing news. What efficiencies are there in using a distributed ledger that's better than the way that news is already being produced right now, and the way that it's kind of reliant in particular on just a handful of proprietary algorithms to surface the work that's done, whether it's Google News or Facebook or Twitter. It doesn't seem like a good state of affairs that those are pretty much determining which stories get elevated and read and which don't. So maybe blockchain offers a better way to do that. And so that's the second category is process improvement. And then there's kind of some of the more exciting stuff. It's all exciting, but some of the really new frontier is I would put in a third bucket, and that's these areas where the ethos of blockchain and distributed ledgers and Web3 almost perfectly aligns with parts of the ethos of journalism, and that's that both worlds are really in agreement over the importance of a suspicion of centralized powers, and also place a high value on transparency, and then also on the value of creating something immutable, a permanent record, which is both journalists and people that work in blockchain ostensibly are trying to do that. So that's kind of the big three buckets that are exciting to me.
On a meta level, I think, part of this podcast journey should be really nailing down our memes to that effect. I don't think, we have those snappy memes to throw around. And if you listen to the Bankless podcast, some of their early episodes were kind of establishing these memes that they kind of keep reiterating over the course of the show, which I find helpful, the repetition, and kind of drills it into your head. And maybe something not your keys, not your content, or something would be good for us, or just something that's journalism focused, that really demonstrates the value prop here. But I'm getting a little frustrated with crypto critics and the refrain of where are the use cases? Where are the use cases? And it's I'll rattle off 10 of them, and they'll be yeah, but for example, digital permanence, we don't have that, and you can't have that with Web2. So many journalists have gone through content migrations where either the place that they were at, or they moved somewhere else, or they got they upgraded their content management system, and then everything got screwed over or lost or manipulated, changed. I think that's a use case that everyone can get behind. And if you can lead people down the thought process of well, how would that even happen? It's well, you have to remove the central point of failure, which means you need a network of computers that can all validate the content has not changed. And now you're into decentralization. It doesn't even have to be distributed ledger in the case of IPFS, but just you need ultimate redundancy and then verification models to accomplish this. And I think if you start with the harm, the solution, why that solution needs to be decentralization, like why, because I still think decentralization kind of rings on or falls on deaf ears, because like, what does that even mean, And it's like,
Yeah, to your point, Keith, when I was explaining this summer, I was explaining to one of my mentors from journalism school, and he's in his mid-70s. And I've been telling him about this technology over the years, just sprinkling it into conversation. And we were talking more in depth about it this summer. And he mentioned how he had he was a community journalism professor, and he had built a community newspaper that had been live for 12 years in a rural or in an urban area of North Carolina. And all of the information, all of the news sat on servers that were owned by a particular entity. And that entity had changed hands over the summer. And the people that owned the server now were not really open to community journalism. They really weren't into it. So he was really worried that that server was going to be shut down, and all of the data, all of the journalism from 12 years of this community was going to be gone. So when I explained what we were doing to him from that lens, he didn't care about the technological terms or any of it. I was just like, this is designed to, once you decentralize your information, it protects it so that one person can't own it. And I think another news outlet, I don't know if it was in Florida or somewhere in the South. Actually, I think it was in Virginia, Charlottesville area. Somebody recently bought a local newspaper, I think, and then was removing stories off of the server that were negative towards them and their business. So that's also, and there's nothing anybody can do.
Yeah. So that's the centralization point that crypto kind of alleviates through the peer-to-peer type of communication. So you have peer-to-peer content, just like you would have peer-to-peer money. Crypto brings in peer-to-peer money. If we don't have peer-to-peer money, and as we move into the digital age, we won't have digital cash. So, there's everything would have to go through Visa or MasterCard or some kind of centralized entity way up there. And all of our eyewitness accounts, all of our information, all of our content will have to go through some kind of central media source where it gets filtered and distilled out. And not in a good way, in a lot of cases, and a lot of times automated through these algorithms, which you've mentioned. In a way, it brings in AI and bots, and even takes human hands out of it. I mean, we could go deep, way down that rabbit hole. Crystal, you wrote a sentence as we were preparing for this, and I wanted to break down this sentence some and hear what you guys have to say, because it's chock full of definitions and things that need defining. So, exploring the nuances between citizen journalism and trad journalism, and if and how Web3 disrupts trad and possibly supports citizens. So I guess we need to definitely explore the nuances between citizen journalism and trad journalism and figure out and define for people what exactly that is.
I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me, not as a journalist, but when I hear citizen journalist or citizen scientist, I kind of distinguish it from institutional journalist or institutional scientist, someone who's presumably had like a formal education and an orientation within an industry and has professional institutional networks and platforms that they can conduct their research on or do their reporting from. And then citizen scientists are presumably more independent in their nature, or maybe self-guided in certain respects, maybe have less of a formal education, or perhaps they've become disillusioned with the institutional approach and have decided to take things into their own methodology. But that's at least what I think of when I hear citizen something here.
The citizen scientist distinction, it works a little bit better, because typically to be a scientist, you have to have some sort of a degree or a certification, to put some letters behind your name. And increasingly that's kind of been the perception for journalism too, but that's actually like a really recent development. And I mean, in the last 20 years, that it's kind of an expectation that most journalists have, gone to at least earn a bachelor's degree, if not a master's degree. But if you go back in the previous century, journalism was really a working class profession where you didn't necessarily have any kind of degree. And the people that I learned from at my first couple jobs like 20 years ago were kind of the last of this generation, where you could have an editor, that is mentoring you who didn't go to college. And by the way, we're excellent journalists. And so it's kind of funny, like the citizen journalism thing is something that has been thrown around in the last 10 to 15 years. And it makes sense in this context of these days we expect all our journalists, particularly national outlets, to have that master's degree from Columbia, which I could get up on a soapbox about this for a long time, because I think it's a real negative development to have everyone that's reporting the news coming from the same class. It's very problematic. So, like, I think some people look at citizen journalism as, it's basically like, okay, here's the untrained volunteers, but I came up through, I do have a degree in journalism, but then I went from school to work in the public radio system, in which plenty of people in public radio, or at least it used to be this way, have no formal training. And there's this really wonderful infrastructure where anyone can go and volunteer at a local public radio station. And I know plenty of people that just started out as a volunteer and they became full-time professional journalists, almost all training on the job without an actual degree. So in some way, I think I have kind of an unconventional idea of what citizen journalism is, in which it's just kind of real journalism, in that, like, any citizen, with half a brain and like the initiative and the care to report fairly on what's going on in their community, like, you can be a real journalist. Like, the degree doesn't really matter. And so, like, I look at Web3 as, like, hopefully helping us get back to that original idea of what a journalist is, and in that the degree isn't important. It's the mission and then, agreeing to some certain ethics and just having a passion for, telling the stories of your community and trying to seek out the truth.
Yeah, that all resonates. I went back to journalism school at 30 to study photojournalism formally, but I was self-taught up to that point. I learned to be a photojournalist by working at a local newspaper out in the mountains. And I was a staff photographer, and a lot of those editors and the guys running the newspaper were like Eric just described. They weren't from journalism schools. So it's interesting to go to journalism school older and see the structure. And it was during, I think I started in 2005 and then wrapped it up around 2007. And it's when social media was coming online. So that it was becoming a thing that we were using. So the conversation that a lot of professors were having, especially the older ones, was about citizen journalism. Where's the ethical line here if everybody can now publish their own content and be their own news reporter with, Twitter and Facebook? So it was really fascinating to watch them have that conversation, and it wasn't a positive one. And especially because some of the older professors it was a professional school, so everybody was a working journalist at some point. So some of them had come up without that formal training. So it was interesting. I think it was really the ethical conversation that worried them, because there was no checks and balances. And I think that's where Web3 introduces that collective fact checking, the thing we're experimenting with now. Can you put attestations onto a story that then show that it was factual, and then can people vouch for it? So that kind of alleviates part of that ethical question that a lot of, journalism academics had when citizen journalism was becoming a thing.
That's really cool, because anybody, like Eric explained, could be a journalist, and then brings in the ethical questions that you had brought up, Crystal. And there's got to be some kind of checks and balances. So degrees formed, and I'm not dogging degrees. I mean, I have degrees as well, just not in journalism. But so it does bring a sense of legitimacy to what somebody's saying, because they've paid their dues. And everybody in an industry wants to work with people who have paid their dues. But then it starts to choke out and eliminate new voices, and it creates a knowledge gap in there. And then this need for decentralization just explodes, and it explodes through technology, as we've seen. And then the internet came about, and then suddenly you have YouTube and BitChute and Odyssey and DLive and all these ways to upload your content, and you have this explosion of just this cosmic soup of just ideas and good, bad, ugly, everything, you name it, and there's no way to filter it. So then come the algorithms and the technology again to try to centralize and choke it off again. So where are we?
I think you just laid it out pretty well. We're in the age of algorithms being too centralized, and we need to diverge from that and put people in control of the algorithms, or make the algorithms serve people instead of the other way around. I mean, I think that points to a decoupling for me. Speaking of like credentials and degrees, I think part of what we're trying to do at JournoDAO is to decouple journalism from like identity, where like, okay, this person's a journalist, and more like acts of journalism. Like if you've seen that Ratatouille movie, Anybody Can Cook. I think anybody potentially, like, talent can come from anywhere, effort can come from anywhere, and the more we can like lay out ideas of what would make good journalism happen for communities and for people, so that anyone who's motivated and passionate can do good work and learn from the whole tradition of best practices and what's been valuable, while also leaving room for innovation and new voices. I think accessibility is without giving up like a desire for quality, I think is possible, and something we should encourage and figure out just exactly how to nurture that.
And John, the point you made, I think we're seeing in our communities now what happens when we allow information to just flow freely without any kind of check and balance. I mean, our public health system's broken, our politics are broken. And a lot of that's because of the information that people have chosen to consume and chosen to take as truth. And because people produced it and put it out, and then the algorithms delivered it. So we're actually just watching it happen in real time. And then if we can continue to stand up this viable solution over here on the other side, at some point, I mean, I know people are already looking for a solution. So here's this other model that can counterbalance the destruction that's happened because of centralization.
So we're a decentralized autonomous organization. I guess we can kind of clarify what that means, why we chose this format. What, as a community, are we trying to do? This is a huge problem, and we're just a ragtag group of 5 people right here. Like, who are we to think that we can change journalism through decentralization?
I mean, I think we're just a handful of people trying shit out, and like, why not? I mean, I guess technically we're not like fully decentralized in the way people think of what a DAO is, in terms of, having a bunch of tokens and making, voting on everything on chain. We've decided not to go that route just yet. After kind of watching how that went when some DAOs like leapt into that feet first, and there's all sorts of concerns. So we're just like kind of trying to work things out, while I think not going through the motions of all the stuff on chain. We're still like adopting that ethos. But I started the JournoDAO server initially after spending some time in Bankless, and just looking around at like the really amazing breadth of experience and backgrounds, even like geographic locations of the people that were coming together. Basically around one central meme to do cool stuff and to like just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And I just remember looking around that community of like thousands of people and thinking like, if all the people in this community were journalists or citizen journalists, like we would have a wire service to rival like the Associated Press or Reuters. And so then the idea is like, well, maybe we should try that. And so that's kind of the idea, and I think we've got a long way to go to get there. But that's kind of the initial brain explosion.
And also for anyone listening who may not be familiar with the term DAO, it's largely without clear definition. It's a lot of different things are all calling themselves DAOs, and there are kind of purist arguments that say if your organization isn't fully decentralized, not a real DAO. I mean, I think there's some truth to that idealistically, but in a concrete, kind of simplified way, I would say a DAO is it's a digital collective, a digital cooperative. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. And in really concrete terms, it's any group of people that use governance tokens to come to collective decisions, whether or not those decisions are totally executive, like any financial decision is passed through the DAO, or maybe it's just some decisions that are made this way. That to me is when an organization gets into DAO territories, when these collective decisions are facilitated on distributed ledgers using governance tokens. But I'm not sure if we need to go into what those terms mean. I think, John, depending on how into the weeds we want to go for those.
Oh, well, I was gonna leave that because it's like it's a rabbit hole. But as far as like the experience of coming together with you all and us being the ones here at the intersection of like Web3 and journalism, like I think I was ranting at Crystal one time about this. I'm like, why is it us? Like there's so many like other people who could have like seized this opportunity, and we're like looking around and it's just it's a vacuum of like all the journalists who should be here instead of us. I think Web3 is a scam or whatever, and so for whatever reason, we're the only people who saw the need, and so we started calling ourselves the bad news bears of journalism, because we're just like, could have been like the big names and like the people who were already in the space, and but they like explicitly have like no interest in being here. So like it's up to us, I guess.
Yeah, I think we're just like scrappy and stubborn enough too. Like I feel like that's part of it. And also, we talked about this in the server a few weeks ago. I mean, there's some of the voices that are so against Web3 that are in journalism also are coming, and not just in journalism, and also thought leaders in other areas are coming from a place of privilege. So they don't need to worry about these things, or they've chosen not to. So they've already built their platforms on Web2. They've already benefited from centralization. So of course, they're not looking at it through the lens of necessity. They're looking at it through the lens of I've already, I've made my thing. And here's this thing that threatens the thing that I've made because I have chosen not to understand it, or I'm looking at it through a different lens. So I think that's part of the conversation too, that hopefully will just drift off as this technology shows more proof of concept. Then that conversation will just get quieter. But we're also at this intersection of emerging tech, and change and disruption. It's extremely uncomfortable, and journalists are stubborn. So.
I mean, the stereotype in the U.S. is that most journalists are pretty liberal, and that I'm talking politically, and I think there's actually plenty of survey results to back this up. But in terms of how we approach our industry and our careers, journalists are actually really conservative and like really slow to adopt technology and adopt change, which is witnessed by the fact that the industry has been crushed by the internet and social media over the last 2 decades. I mean, the thing that did more damage to the business model of local newspapers was a Craigslist, which it doesn't get much more basic than that. So when you're outcompeted by literally just Craig Newmark, then I think that's all you need to know.
Yeah, the Craigslist thing was really the thing that really brought the concept to me, and the whole peer-to-peer, content, peer-to-peer information sharing. And I guess what we're doing as a DAO is we're just doing peer-to-peer sharing of ideas that we've kind of lost track of. Stumbling through some of the Web3 tools. I mean, I've always poked around a little bit of HTML code and stuff like that, but I've never been Mr. Hardcore technologist or programmer. And I think that's a huge hurdle for a lot of journalists and people getting into Web3 to have to get over, is people don't have the basic foundations of information technology and information systems. You know, I took computer science 101 in ninth grade. And then from there, I kind of just had to learn how to do some things myself to where I could put together some web pages later on in my adult life. But that was upon my own initiative. And a lot of people just don't have that education. And so they see Web3 and they hear blockchain technology and just suddenly scared off. And they just think it's just something for total techie nerds. And so the concepts start to escape them.
I think a lot of it comes down to language and how we explain it to people. The other day, I was explaining public goods and DAOs to yoga teachers, and they have zero desire to engage with technology. And when I explained what we were doing here at JournoDAO and I put it in the context of yoga, everybody wanted to learn it. And then the next meeting we had, I showed them how to use Discord. And I was sitting there and they're like, we're on Discord now. I'm like, that's the cutest thing ever. So I think you really have to come into the conversation by, their pain points and what they want to change, like the mission itself. Technology is just
how would you put that in? Sorry, how would you put that in the context of yoga?
I said yoga should be a public good, and we should govern. We could form these small groups just like we're doing with DAOs, and we can call them DAOs or call them whatever yoga language you want to use, and then we self-govern through technology. And then you create a protocol, and just like we're doing with figuring out here, you experiment, create the protocol, figure out how to fund it with this alternative economic system, and then you drop it in other communities, and then you let them dictate what it looks like for their community. It's the same with journalism. You just let us form prototypes and then form organizations and then sprinkle it around. That makes sense.
So a protocol is just a set of guidelines, a way of doing things within a certain framework that you can kind of lift out of one organization and plop into another one. And if they follow the same, then the same result should ideally happen, right?
Yeah. I mean, just like cooperatives. Okay. I mean, here's a cooperative structure. Here's the technical stack you use. Here's the human stack you use. Here's how you organize through technology. And then here's how you take it into real life. You need to have that bridge between technology and IRL, or else it's kind of just us playing on our computers.
And I think you can also, correct me if I'm wrong, you can also think of a protocol as not necessarily something that is taken out and then like plopped in like a plug and play thing, but it's also common rails that any organization can tap into. Like obviously the internet is built on protocols, so we don't take the internet and like take it up and we put it in this other company's infrastructure. Everyone just taps into it. So it can be, infra or intra or inter, right? Whatever.
Yeah.
So a protocol is like a public good. It's a common set of rules that aren't owned by anybody, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they can't be, they can't be enclosed in the market. And I think that's the big point, like with yoga and journalism. The market enclosure is the problem. Once it becomes a profit model, then the worst parts of whatever, like clickbait, all those things that you use to drive monetization become the deciding factor, not the actual quality of the thing you're making.
So the profit model is the ad-driven model, right? And you have to get those clicks. So therefore you create content that'll give you clicks, so you'll get money, so you can, feed yourselves and continue being a journalist, right? But then at the cost of your integrity.
Yeah. And the same applies to yoga too. We have a lot of yoga is done by class. So there's a certain class that has resources, and that's how a lot of yoga is accessed. So you're eliminating an entire population, multiple populations that can't access it because it's too expensive to get in the classroom. And then you lose the spirituality aspect of the quality of it because it's being taught in a way that's commoditized because it's a business. And that's, it's just the way it is.
I was just going to say, it's always good to like explain how this is different than now, because, people could say, well, that's like Facebook. You just start like a Facebook group or like a subreddit, or like there's meetup.com. Like there's plenty of places where you could just like form a yoga group or whatever. But then it's like, and so you have to explain, okay, but what if, meetup.com goes out of business? What if somebody buys meetup.com? Like we kind of socialize at the behest of these companies. And so even if like the business model and the advertising doesn't bother you, if you want to build something that can last and that you actually have control over, then you're going to have to move to like a Web3 decentralized version of things, because then, like I was saying, you get digital permanence. You can build for the long term, because it's nigh impossible to bring these things down once you build them.
And also the human aspect. I mean, like even the meetup example, there's meetups that I join, but I don't feel connected to them as family. Whereas with JournalDAO, I feel like y'all are like my ride or die bitches. Like, this is family. And so I think that's part of it too, is not just the technical aspect, but the organizational aspect. Like, can you bring humans together from all over the place, find this common mission, and then become this cohesive unit where you can move something complicated like this forward? And I think that's also a really interesting dynamic that hasn't really been in play. I mean, yeah, you could do it in a Facebook group, but like here we own all of the collaboration aspects. So yes, Discord is kind of a dumpster fire, but it's still, nobody's like, when I'm in Discord, I'm not worried that Zuckerberg's hanging over my shoulder, like, hey, what are you talking about?
Yeah. And we have the right to exit. I mean, we can move to a different platform where, like, if you're going to try and get a Facebook group to move somewhere else, like it'll probably just dissolve. But I think, removing the community from the tools and then being able to choose permanent tools that you actually own and control, I think is the power of it. But I think you kind of have to lay down the harms and the difference, because, people say, well, I can just use Venmo to send money. And so we just need to think more deeply about like how these transactions and how these interactions are actually enabled behind the scenes, at least like on a conceptual level, so that we can really clarify to journalists like how this is different and how it's fundamentally not necessarily better, but like I think better in the way that there's more opportunity to build something that's what you want, rather than just morphing what you want into the tools of some other business's agenda. So
I find that argument that Keith is alluding to, that we definitely hear a lot of like, well, all these things that you want to do, all these things that you're building, like this thing that we have over here, like it already does that. And it's like, well, if it already does it so perfectly, why are all these people building all these alternatives? Like there's clearly a demand or a dissatisfaction with the way that the current paradigm operates and the way that the current systems are handling things. Like I feel like there's no point in even like addressing those like, well, we don't need to, we've already got that. It's like, well, we do, and maybe it can be better.
I mean, Twitter's a great example. We don't even have to all you have to do is just say, look at Twitter. I mean, watching journalists and media outlets navigating what Musk has done to Twitter in the last 2 months is fascinating. And then to see journalists and media outlets go to another centralized social media platform like Post News without any acknowledgement that they're just going from one devil to the next one. And then watching a handful of them go to Mastodon and be like, oh, what's this decentralization thing? I'm like, oh, it's the thing we've been talking about for years. So that to me is fascinating. As these systems collapse, I mean, with Trump coming back into Facebook, we're going to see another wave. People are going to have to really have a come to Jesus about using these platforms that are destroying their families. I mean, I'm watching friends who have teenagers navigate the things that their teenagers are seeing on Twitter and the things they're following, and it is heartbreaking. So I think that as more of that unravels and happens, then I think people are openly looking for alternatives. So I think it'll be easier to, not that we need to go around convincing everybody, but it'll just be easier to have the conversation.
And it does feel, at least I get the sense that we're at this, maybe it's a transitional phase where, at least in the case of JournalDAO and a lot of other DAOs, part of their presence, part of their structure is kind of directly on the decentralized protocol level, where they have control over the tools, like the token contracts and everything. They have kind of direct, unmediated control over some of their presence, some of their structure, but then some of their structure is still kind of mediated by these platforms that do facilitate communication and coordination and make a lot of stuff easier in certain respects. And I guess it's just a matter of identifying, how much of our structure can we transfer to this direct, decentralized protocol level, then how much do we need to rely on platforms to make our lives easier? And it feels like you could potentially view that as a transition, where as the people driving the organization or the lead contributors get a better sense of how to navigate the unmediated, decentralized level, they can build more and more of that organization on that level and have to rely less and less on the platforms. But maybe it's having some degree of reliance on the platforms isn't that big a deal, so long as we're not entirely reliant on them.
Yeah, still got to eat, and that's one thing that people say about the ad-driven model. Okay, we know the ad-driven model's bad and all, and you have these amazing, wonderful tools over here. Decentralization is great, but I still got to eat at the end of the day. So I guess we can close out with maybe we're kind of over time. I guess that's why we're a podcast. We can keep this conversation going, but what's a Web3 tool that will help us be able to eat and do journalism in a decentralized way?
I think figuring out how to do UBI through DAOs. We could figure that little nugget out. I know we've brainstormed on it. I think that is one avenue of support so we can all eat. And then as treasuries grow, you're able to spread that UBI around to the community as well. That's just one tiny little nugget.
And I mean, I feel like we can. Okay. We already have the tools to do stuff like that. It seems like in our case and in other cases, it's just a matter of where do you get the money to even distribute that way, or do you rely on some Ponzi-nomic, native token system that's questionable in all of its own ways? But I do think there's potential for stuff like that, and maybe it's just a matter of an organization getting set up as the right kind of nonprofit structure to accept, philanthropic donations that can be distributed in this kind of UBI-like way. But then I guess that organization needs to be doing something to deserve those donations from whoever is making them, I suppose.
And I think Substack's a good bridge tool, because it's getting some adoption, it's seeing some success. Like, people have seen being an individual with a small number of dedicated subscribers can actually pay the bills. But then so that's great, but then what if you want to charge people less, or you can't quite make ends meet? Then if you get rid of Substack and you control the relationship with the audience, that little margin might end up being the difference for people. And so just explaining it in terms of control, ownership, and take rate, I think the models aren't built yet, but the people who see an opportunity, there's tons of better tools out there to just take existing models and make them more efficient, make them work for you, and lower the threshold of how much of an audience you need. Because if you're going to pay the bills with advertising, you need 20 to 30x the audience that you need if you're subscription based. And so, just talking numbers with people and just practical, how many fans can you get? How many subscribers can you get? I think, to me at least, it seems more manageable than trying to get an ever decreasing click per 1,000 rate, for ever deteriorating quality of ads for an ever shrinking portion of audience that allows themselves to be tracked. And it's just, I think it just makes a lot of sense to content creators, including journalists, to be okay, I just want to do this thing. I want to find the people who like it, and then I'll charge them a reasonable fee for me to do it. And that's not possible with an intermediary, because that intermediary needs to run a business that's supported by those transactions. And so the numbers all have to be like way higher. You take out the intermediary and suddenly it becomes like doable, because you don't have to pay the overhead of this whole other company in between you and your audience.
So I guess thinking more long term, there's surveys that tell us that something like in excess of 70% of people, this is in the U.S., don't trust the media, which is just such an utter collapse of an industry that is built on trust, that it's amazing. And we have, with blockchain, distributed ledgers, decentralized servers, this kind of suite of technologies that we're talking about, you can strip away all the financialization stuff and just focus on the idea of a immutable, decentralized source to store information. And it's just like custom made for journalists to actually fulfill the promise of the transparency that we always say that we're about, being transparent. The reality is that journalism, like every other industry, is competitive, and outlets are competing with each other. So you're always holding some amount of information, sources, even revisions and errors that you make in your stories. There's incentive to obscure all that and to keep it close to the vest. And due to that reality, it's not necessarily surprising, I suppose, that the trust numbers are that low. But this technology allows us the option to actually do the transparency that we talk about in a radical new way. And I think it's a long path to being able to eat, but to actually do journalism and to build this new protocol for gathering and reporting the news in a more transparent way than it's ever been done before, I think that's a meal ticket.
Well, how much longer? Because I'm super hungry.
Stomach problems. Slow down.
Yeah. That's right. I'm hearing basically a lot of we're bringing it back to our own neighborhood, to our own communities. And if you're a person that lives in your community and you do well by your community, you're not going to starve. Everybody's going to get together, band together, borrow a cup of sugar, give a cup of sugar, and help each other out. They're not going to let one person in the community get rich. You got to take everybody with you, But that's just part of living in a community, and I think that applies to journalism as well. Bring back the information and the news back to our communities, stuff that's relevant to us. Speaking of eating, JournoDAO has an NFT. So go to JournoXYZ. You can always contact one of us and figure out how to get this NFT. It's purely a NFT to support JournoDAO, so you're not going to get rich off speculating on it. So yeah, and we also have an NFT for this particular episode 1 that's free. And go to JournoDAO.xyz, and you will be able to add that to your wallet to be able to display to the world, if anybody ever looks up your ETH address or whatever, to show that you are an OG fan and supporter and follower of JournoDAO. And who knows, maybe one day we'll be like the first people on MTV, Martha Quinn, Kurt Loder, and all that group. It's how they started it, right? So if only they had NFTs of the first MTV flags, but with the astronaut.
I'm just wondering if in 30 years that means we're all going to be on Fox Business with Kennedy. I think that's what you just said.
Oh God!
Yes,
which
Kennedy.
One of this is not Penfield.
Yeah. Well, I think we know the answer to that, Keith.
Yeah. All right, then. Good episode, you all, and we'll see you on the other side.